There we go. And with that, I now want to introduce a little more extensively than I did previously Archbishop John C. Wester of the Santa Fe Archdiocese. And he explained to me just before he came on, no, he has not been wrestling with Satan. He has had what, some skin burns on his face. Uh, so whatever. So he looks a little beat up, but that is all taken care of his skin. And so Archbishop Wester and I, we've been working, pretty closely for what, like 5 years now, I think. And we're headed to Japan for the bombing anniversaries for the third consecutive year this coming August. And that'll be the 80th anniversaries. But I do want to praise Archbishop Wester to high heaven. He has passionately uptaken the cause of nuclear disarmament. And in short, I just think he's a wonderful person. So over to you, Archbishop.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. I appreciate your kind words very, very much. And thank you all. I'm very honored to be with you tonight and to be part of this NukeWatch presentation. And I can certainly I want to say to you how much I admire you for your dedication to this cause. It's not an easy cause to have. It's not a popular one. So I'm really learning a lot from you, and I've learned an awful lot from Jay, who, as he indicated, has become a very dear friend of mine, and I feel very honored to be counted among his friends. Um, for me, it wasn't long after I was assigned here as the Catholic Archbishop of Santa Fe, New Mexico, that I realized that the Archdiocese has, I think, a very special role to play in the whole nuclear disarmament movement. Obviously, it's within the Archdiocese at LANL that the whole nuclear weapons began. And of course, people now have seen the movie Oppenheimer if they had forgotten that. And so I felt that our Archdiocese has a special place at the table. And I know that I see Dr. David Denny Frank is on this Zoom meeting, and his group there at one of our parishes and others I know are very much involved in this important work. As we all know, we're in an accelerating new nuclear arms race that's made even more dangerous because of artificial intelligence and multiple nuclear actors and hypersonic delivery systems. An already scary situation has become even scarier. And what concerns me, of course, is that at Los Alamos here in our Santa Fe, it plays a key role in actually fostering and promoting this new nuclear arms race, a race which I believe is an affront to all that is good and holy, that all, from our perspective, all that God has placed in us to live in harmony with one another. And nuclear weapons pose one of the greatest threats to that harmony. I think it's important to know what I'm learning more and more about is that expanded plutonium pit production is not simply to maintain the safety and reliability of our existing so-called deterrents. I think it's important that people are aware that it's really for new design nuclear weapons for this new nuclear arms race. And that's, I think, important for us to keep in mind. We had a symposium at the University of New Mexico last September, and that really was the theme of our symposium, deterrence or disarmament. I think it's important that people recognize that deterrence is not the way to go. In that light, I would say, obviously, for me as a Catholic bishop, Pope Francis, I think, has really changed the whole moral landscape of looking at nuclear weapons. On the 70th anniversary of the Hiroshima atomic bombing, Pope Francis declared that the very possession of nuclear weapons is immoral. And if you drive down by Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Santa Fe, you'll see a little sign that Jay and NukeWatch put up there to remind us of that very important statement. For us as Catholics, this was an extremely important shift. Our 1983 Peace Pastoral of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops did allow for deterrence. It was promoting disarmament, but it made a caveat and said allowed for deterrence. But Pope Francis has taken that off the table. And he said that even possessing nuclear weapons is immoral, it's unethical. One of the main reasons for this church's shift on this was that the nuclear weapons powers really have failed in their pledge in 1970 when they joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's really has failed. And so the TPNW came about because of that failure. And so it seems to me then, based on what Pope Francis said, that if possessing nuclear weapons are immoral, then expanding plutonium pit cores, modernizing our weapons systems in order to be more involved in the new nuclear arms race is also immoral, that this policy is unethical. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not saying that anyone working at LANL or Sandia or Lawrence Livermore in California, I'm not judging them or saying they're immoral. That's a different matter, one's conscience. I'm saying that the policy is immoral. And the Pope has said that nuclear weapons themselves are intrinsically immoral. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that we need to be moving toward disarmament. And that if that's not our trajectory, rather if it's just to build up our defenses, then that's an immoral buildup. And so that's, I think, for us from a church point of view, from a religious point of view, and I think people of any religion or no religion would have to come to agree that we're in a terrible mess, that we have created instruments of destruction that are beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. And the devastation and destructions to humankind and to the planet, to the creation, to our common home, are just too difficult to even begin to think about. And so this is what I have committed our Archdiocese, our Peace and Justice Commission. I'm hoping that our different parish commissions will more and more sound the clarion call for nuclear disarmament. One way, of course, for us to do this is through the LANL site-wide environmental impact statement. And I would join NukeWatch in encouraging citizens to make their views known, not only through the statewide EIS, but also to the members of Congress, and to let them know of our views on this. Also, there's a lot we can do. For one thing, I'm looking forward to joining Jay in August, this coming summer. Well, before I get to that, I'm looking forward to just next month to going to the UN in the first week of March there for the third meeting of the state parties on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I was very gratified and very honored that I was able to say a few words at last year's state parties meeting, and I'm looking forward to doing it again this year. I'm looking forward to saying Mass several times there in the UN and for different groups I've gotten together, Pax Christi and other groups, and also to going to pray with the Pax Christi group that's going to be there on Wednesday, March 5th, to protest the nuclear weapons. Also, Jay, as I mentioned, Jay and I are going to go to the 80th commemoration of the bombings in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki this August. And of course, Jay and I and members of my archdiocese have joined in a partnership for a world without nuclear weapons, a partnership for a world without nuclear weapons, PWNW. And that's the Archdiocese of Seattle, Archbishop Etchen, myself here in Santa Fe, Bishop Shirahama in Hiroshima, and Archbishop Nakamura, along with Archbishop Emeritus Takami in Nagasaki, to form this partnership. We formed this partnership so we can be a voice seeking nuclear disarmament. So please keep that in your thoughts and prayers. You'll be hearing more about us, this partnership, and I think it's going to be very important to get the word out there. We're going to be joined by Cardinal McElroy and Cardinal Stupich in August as well. I know there'll be some Vatican representatives there as well. So I'm looking forward to being able to be there to give witness to this important movement. Also, I just got off the phone about an hour ago with the Congressman Jim McGovern in Massachusetts, and he is very been talking to some of his fellow congresspersons and trying to do what they can do to promote the important movement of nuclear disarmament as well. He's very interested in the March meeting of states parties at the UN, and also very interested in what's going to go on in Japan in August. And also, I was very pleased he was talking about with Charles Washburn about getting young people involved in this movement. I think it's very important. I'm 74 now, which I still like to think of as being young, I hope, relatively at least. And but we do need really young people to really be part of, to kind of engage them in this movement, because I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis when I was 12 years old in 1962. But a lot of our young people in our country have no memory of that. They have no visceral memory of it. No, so I think it's important for us to engage them as well. So anyway, I want to thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for all that you do from my point of view, and assure you of my prayers and my support, especially to you, Jay, and all involved with NukeWatch. So thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you so much, Archbishop. And I really look forward to going to Japan with you again this August, except it is so hot and humid. Y'all wouldn't believe how hot and humid it is in Japan in August, but that's me just whining. But thank you again, Archbishop. Sophie, if you could put the next slide on, and I'm basically going to show you all why you should be extremely cynical about this site-wide EIS. And then I'll contradict myself and try to convince you that nevertheless, you should be involved in it, go to the hearings, and submit formal written comment. And then, as I put it, obviously I'm not mincing words here. Uh, Fundamentally, I believe that this new site-wide environmental impact statement for Los Alamos is a rigged game. And to put it in context, the last full site-wide EIS was in 2008, and a whole lot has happened since then. And then, as most of you surely know, Los Alamos has been assigned the job of expanded production of plutonium pit bomb cores. Now, what I'm cynically pointing to is what the National Nuclear Security Administration has done. And to clarify, NNSA is the nuclear, and it's semi-autonomous. It kind of rules itself. It doesn't really matter who the Department of Energy secretary is. NNSA rules itself as a semi-autonomous nuclear weapons agency within the Department of Energy. But what the NNSA has presented us with in this site-wide is they give three alternative futures for the laboratory. And all of this is a requirement under the National Environmental Policy Act. And I like to point out the pros and cons of the National Environmental Policy Act. The good news is that it requires the government to put up its major federal proposals, to put them up to public scrutiny where the public can comment on those proposals. That's the good news. The bad news is it by no means requires the government to reach good decisions. So what the government has done, what NNSA has done in this instance, the three alternatives are first, expanded nuclear weapons programs. And in this, that's contradictorily called the no action alternative. So right there, we're presented with a rigged game. The second alternative is even more expanded nuclear weapons programs. And the third alternative is yet more expanded nuclear weapons programs. There is no alternative for trying to dampen down the nuclear arms race. And I'll point out that essentially all three alternatives revolve around the expanded production of plutonium pit bomb cores. So that's kind of a bottom line. So just as a starting place, NukeWatch wants to suggest that citizens should protest just to begin with this rigged game, this constricted range of alternatives that is really all about what NNSA wants and not necessarily what is good for the country. Now, Sophie, if you could move to the next slide, having made these cynical expressions, again, I still want to convince you to be involved for the reasons listed here. Is that, first of all, these NEPA processes do result in the public getting valuable information that it otherwise would not have. And it does increase transparency and accountability. And to add a contemporary note, I would observe that under the new president, this is vitally needed more than ever. My second point, I'm somewhat litigious. I have been involved in roughly a half dozen lawsuits under NEPA with others. It's not me alone. Um, we've lost one out of six but that was a capricious ruling from the bench. But anyway, given that I'm somewhat litigious, these NEPA processes sometimes can lead to important litigation in the future. And you can't really litigate over it unless you've submitted comprehensively and on whatever subjects you might want to end up litigating over. And my third and final point, and this will take a little bit of time for me to explain, but I do have it in writing. The NEPA processes actually result in very important tangible benefits for the public and the government. And the specific case I'd like to point to is a draft 1999 site-wide EIS for Los Alamos. And I pointed out how DOE did not analyze the risk of wildfire. And I submitted, like a dozen major points. And that was the one and only point they agreed with me. And they went ahead in the final site-wide to describe this hypothetical fire that the New Mexican newspaper later said it was, quote, eerie, how the real Cerro Grande fire matched the hypothetical fire. And laboratory management consulted that hypothetical fire to order mandatory evacuation of the lab. And then, most importantly, in my book, the lab undertook fire mitigation measures that arguably prevented the Cerro Grande fire from reaching Area G, where at the time, 44,000 barrels of plutonium waste were being stored above ground. And I don't want to engage in hyperbole, but had those waste barrels ruptured and released respirable plutonium to the ambient air, that could have been truly catastrophic. And then I included this quote at the bottom that even LANL Public Relations ended up recognizing the value of public comment. So I want to stop right there. And I'm going to turn it over to Dylan Spaulding, who I think just has a great slide presentation on the need, or rather the lack of true need for this expanded pit production. So Dylan, thank you so much for your presentation. I very much appreciate the collaboration with Union of Concerned Scientists on this. And over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Can I get a thumbs up from Jared? Great. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Jay, and thank you, Archbishop Wester, for your comments. I appreciate the comments on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and your both of your efforts to be involved in the anniversaries there. I had the opportunity to visit both sites last year and have also had the opportunity to visit the Nevada test site, where you can see mangled pieces of steel I-beams and other structures left over from nuclear testing. And although they're almost identical to some of the objects you can see in the Japanese museums, the contrast couldn't be more stark in their meaning. I think it's important for people to experience that. I'm here tonight to address how the draft environmental impact statement relates to efforts at Los Alamos to ramp up plutonium pit production. So, Sophie, if we can go to the next slide, please. For anyone not aware, what we call a pit is the plutonium component within the primary stage of a modern thermonuclear weapon. You can think of it as something like a hollow, softball-sized object that's imploded by high explosives that surround it. And this triggers the nuclear chain reaction that makes nuclear weapons so powerful. All of the modern weapons in the US stockpile are two-stage devices, which means plutonium is in the first stage, uranium is typically in the secondary, and so the purpose of the pit is sort of like a nuclear spark plug to set off the weapon. And that's what Los Alamos is proposing to produce and is actually beginning to produce already. They are currently charged with ramping up production to be able to make at least 30 pits per year, which they estimate they will do by 2028, and to potentially increase that production under what they call surge capacity to as many as 80 pits per year. And many of the proposed projects in this draft EIS have to do with facilities that support pit production in one way or another. It's one of the most ambitious projects right now, driving growth of the workforce, thousands of new employees, and infrastructure across the lab. And the draft environmental impact statement opens with the quote that I'm showing on this slide, which states that restoring the ability to produce plutonium pits for primaries will guard against the uncertainties of plutonium aging in today's stockpile and will allow new pit designs to be manufactured if necessary for future weapons. But I think this really obfuscates what's going on, as Archbishop Wester and Jay both alluded to, in terms of the immediate need for pits, as well as the government's plans for a completely overhauled U.S. nuclear stockpile. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, although the quote says, if necessary for future weapons, which I've highlighted there, in fact, new pits from Los Alamos are only for new weapons, which we consider unnecessary. Pit production is not currently being undertaken as part of the traditional stockpile stewardship program, which was a program that the US has carried out since the end of the Cold War to maintain the safety, security, and reliability of our existing nuclear weapons. So that's not what this is about. In fact, new pits are destined for brand new designs, and these will be the first new nuclear warheads to be deployed since the Cold War. So I think it's critical to understand that this is a huge paradigm shift in the role of the national labs. Instead of maintaining the arsenal we have, many of the proposed changes in the draft EIS have to do with returning to a production mindset, in which modernized weapons will be built with all new components. And this is happening across all three legs of what we call the nuclear triad, which includes warheads for missiles, bombers, and submarines. But importantly, the first decade or so of production at Los Alamos is slated to supply a new intercontinental ballistic missile warhead, which is called the W-87-1, which is shown here on the cover of a Lawrence Livermore publication as reinvigorating the enterprise. And meanwhile, a second pit production plant is under construction at Savannah River, South Carolina. And that facility is intended to produce pits for the W-93 warhead, which is another new warhead that would go on U.S. nuclear submarines. The NNSA's future plans in the Stockpile Stewardship Management Plan suggest several more new warheads to follow in the 2030s and 2040s. So no longer are the U.S. content to maintain and refurbish our nuclear arsenal. Much of the development going on right now is about establishing new production capability. So while the NNSA often points to uncertainties around plutonium aging in today's stockpile, as this quote at the top of the slide shows, the truth is that the issue will not require plutonium pits for decades to come, and we know this scientifically. If we can go to the next slide, please. So There are many ways that the labs have at their disposal to study the material science, the chemistry, the structure of plutonium as a function of age. They can conduct accelerated aging studies, in which they can effectively speed up effects from aging to simulate um, a plutonium sample that's 100 or 200 years old and look at the effects over time and whether there's degradation that occurs on relevant timescales. There are more technical issues, things such as void swelling and helium bubble formation, which is essentially the idea that the internal structure of plutonium could be degrading at the atomic level, leading it to sort of turn into a metaphorically sort of Swiss cheese over time, which a more porous, atomically damaged structure of the metal. However, there's little or no scientific evidence that this happens over the anticipated service life of pits. There have been several independent studies of plutonium aging, as most of you are probably aware, one of them from the Jason committee, which is an independent expert committee that advises DOE and DoD. They've estimated that plutonium pits have lifespans of at least 85 to 100 years. I've conducted a study for the Union of Concerned Scientists based on all of the unclassified literature that is accessible to us, and I concur with that assessment. The oldest pits in our current stockpile now are only approaching about 50 years old, and the youngest are about 34, 35 years old, which means that if aging is a concern, we have decades to deal with this problem. That's not an excuse to rush into a program that potentially raises the risk to workers and the public. Next slide, please. So the reason we know this is largely, again, because of the data from the labs themselves. So between Los Alamos, Livermore, Sandia, and the Nevada test site, the labs have a really diverse array of scientific tools available that they have used already to study plutonium across a wide range of pressures and temperatures. So, of course, a weapon's reliability, in order to understand its lifespan or its performance margin, as the labs call it, you have to not only understand how plutonium ages on the shelf, so to speak, inside the warhead or while it's sitting on a missile or in a submarine, but also how any changes to the plutonium will affect a weapon's performance. So as it's actually detonating. This means understanding a huge range of thermodynamic conditions that come close to simulating what happens to it throughout its operation if it ever were to be used. And since the US stopped nuclear testing in 1992, the labs have developed a number of tools to do just that, all the way from benchtop chemistry that I'm showing here on the left, all the way up to subcritical tests on the right-hand side of this slide that are conducted underground in Nevada with larger quantities of nuclear material. None of these experimental methods have shown evidence of runaway degradation in plutonium, nor, so far at least, any evidence of a performance cliff in which the material properties may rapidly cause failure or unreliability, or any issues for safety, security, or reliability. So the point of this is that the labs have time to address aging issues without rushing towards unnecessary production of pits. If this is about ensuring that aging is not affecting our current stockpile, we have decades to do that. And indeed, pit production introduces a number of new risks, which are on the next slide, if we could. The pit production, as the EIS points out, will lead to increases in every type of waste produced at LANL, low-level, mixed low-level, transuranic, and routine hazardous waste in the coming years. It'll be the leading contributor to all of these categories. Transuranic waste production would triple from about 100 tons to 300 if they indeed resort to what they call surge capacity. That is, if LANL is called upon to produce more than 30 pits and go up to as many as 80 pits a year. And in fact, that's not an improbable scenario because the other facility that's being built at Savannah River is plagued with difficulties. It's severely over budget. It's a facility that is entirely unsuited to being retrofit for what they're trying to do with it. And so there is every likelihood, in fact, that LANL will be called upon to produce more than the 30 pits they're currently aiming for, which will lead to an increase in the waste stream from the lab. This draft EIS, most notably, is calling for 4 new transuranic waste staging sites at Los Alamos across 4 different technical areas, which are proposed to handle waste from pit production. And I note that in the quote here, they say that it is to minimize the potential for a long-term WIP shutdown to affect pit production activities at LANL. Many of you will be aware that WIP shut down in 2014 following two severe accidents. One of them was a vehicle fire. The other was because a waste container sent from Los Alamos ruptured in one of the what they call panels at WIP, which resulted in severe contamination of that part of the facility. So this is, emblematic of problematic waste handling practices at the lab that actually resulted in that accident. And the fact that they are relying potentially on increased storage on site at LANL to guard against a future scenario like that, I think should really raise everyone's concern because waste is much more vulnerable above ground than it is underground, especially if it's still on site. This would allow for up to 6,700 barrels of additional waste to be stored on site and up to 1,500 shipments of waste off-site of all the types listed at the top of the slide would occur annually under LANL's preferred expanded operations alternative through 2038. That includes 219 shipments a year of what's called special nuclear material, which is plutonium in the form of pits or in the form of heat source thermal batteries, which are made of plutonium-238. So that's a truckload every day or two coming down the hill with significant quantities of plutonium aboard. If we can go to the final slide, please. This is raising risk, particularly for workers. I know many of you are community members with concerns about what this means for you, but many of you may also know people or have family who work at the labs. At UCS, one of our biggest concerns about pit production is the risk caused to workers by the manner in which LANL is rushing forward to achieve the 30 pit per year quota. We believe this is unnecessary and it's resulting in increased risk to workers. And I think that's documented in the draft EIS, which shows that the number of workers with measurable radiation doses has more than doubled since 2017. In 2022, there were 4,444 workers with measurable radiation doses. That doesn't mean they're necessarily large doses, but it means they are measurable on the personal dosimetry that the workers wear. But that increase is concerning, and they even note in the EIS that this is potentially due to an increase in number of personnel across multiple shifts, contributing to the increase in annual collective dose at TA 55, which is where pit production is occurring. And of the top 25 doses at LANL in 2022, 22 of them were from pit production. Also in 2021, the highest 25 doses at LANL were from all 25 were from TA55, where pit production occurs. As far as risk to the public comes from potential radiological exposure, the Defense Nuclear Facilities Board has routinely pushed back against engineering choices being made for the PF4 facility at Los Alamos, and LANL has consistently pushed back on those engineering controls that would serve to minimize or control the amount of radiation that could be released following a severe accident, which is where protection of the public is really paramount. And I can answer more questions about that afterwards if you like. So in closing, I want to address one more issue, and which is that of environmental justice. And this is, of course, an issue that is not strictly limited to plutonium pit production, but that should really be at the heart of any environmental impact statement. So at the Union of Concerned Scientists, we work to put science into action, developing solutions and advocating for a healthy, safe, and just future. And environmental justice is top of mind in everything we do. And it's not just because it's in our mission statement, but it's because we believe it's the right thing to do. So I would encourage the audience tonight to pay attention to the aspects of LANL's impact statement that addresses environmental justice. Because in particular, in all three of the scenarios examined in this draft document, they state that, and I quote, the NNSA evaluated the potential impacts in all resource areas and identified no disproportionate and adverse impacts to communities with environmental justice concerns. So many of you are here tonight because you have environmental justice concerns, right? The way in which the EIS appears to discount that, to me, reveals something about the performative nature of the way that NNSA and LANL conduct analyses like these. And this is why your comments, as Jay alluded to, are so deeply important, because this is one of the rare opportunities in which the public does get to register concern in an official forum and in a recorded way. So I hope that everyone here will consider submitting a public comment. I invite you to reach out to our hosts at NukeWatch New Mexico, as well as me and my colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We will have an additional toolkit available shortly to help people who want to write their own comments. And in the coming months, we'll also have a major report that addresses the human and environmental effects of pit production, which I've written really with impacted communities in northern New Mexico in mind. So I invite you to keep your eyes out for that, and I thank you for your attention. I'll send it back to Jay.
Yep. Well, thanks so much, Dylan. And I should have said this in my intro for you, but Dylan has worked at all three nuclear weapons laboratories, that is to say, Los Alamos, Sandia, and Livermore. And he
No.
knows his stuff.
Are
Okay.
you going in your room?
And
40?
please mute who's ever. There we go. But thank you so much, Dylan. And I'm going to repeat something he said. He's coming out with a major report in a couple of months. I've seen a couple of draft chapters, and it is wonderful. I think it's going to be a very important document. I'll also add, and you need to correct me as needed, Dylan, but you are coming to the hearings next week here at Los Alamos, along with your colleague, Catherine Yell of Union of Concerned Scientists. So I look forward to seeing UCS growing involvement, and this is great. Now, I'm going to pause. And this is great. I see one comment, Dylan, you rock. So that's great. And you do. I'm going to pause right now. I'm going to remind people that, first of all, this meeting is being recorded. It will be up on the NukeWatch website, but separately. And, first I want to make sure this is okay with you, Dylan, as well. But as a separate document, we'll have the slides up that are being used within this workshop so that you can have access to the slides without having to wade through the entire program. And then right now, I'm going to, if any, I know we have a few members of the media present, and I'm not looking to out you, but if you want to ask questions now of either Dylan or the Archbishop, go ahead, because I'm thinking, knowing reporters, they usually have a deadline or something. So I want to give you all the capability to ask now if you want to, and but you got to be a reporter, okay? We will have extensive Q&A later, but if there's any reporters. And I can't see the full screen. I don't know if you can, Sophie.
I have Tom Lubin's the only hand I see currently.
Are you a reporter, Tom? And you're on mute.
No, Jay, I'm not a reporter.
Okay, so let's wait. And if no reporters,
Hi, Jay. It's Elena from the Santa Fe New Mexican.
yeah, sorry, I
But
couldn't see you, Elena. So go right ahead.
I figured I would jump right in. I was hoping to ask both the Archbishop and Mr. Spaulding about if there are any questions that come to mind that the public should be asking at these hearings next week.
And Dylan and Archbishop, you'd have to unmute yourself when you go to answer.
I'll let the Archbishop go first if he wants.
Well, yes, I think from my point of view, I don't know a question per se, but from the moral perspective, religious perspective, I would just say that to make your voice known, that you do not see the need for the renewed pit production, and that you feel that this is a real threat to our survival as a human race. So I don't know, that would be, I can't think of a specific question. I would point to those statements that have said very clearly that nuclear weapons are immoral. For example, Pope Francis's statement, and just say that being the case, and the fact that what Dr. Spaulding just so brilliantly put us through just now, that we know that scientifically there's no need. Why are we continuing to do this? And I would just make reference to that we're in a second arms race. And I would also make reference to President Kennedy's peace speech in 1962, 63. I might have the wrong dates there, but right before he was assassinated. And when he very, I think, beautifully said that, this is insane, this arms race. So why are we repeating it again? I would put that question to them. What I hear from the scientists I've talked to that work at LANL or Sandia is they say, well, yeah, but if you had a flashlight and the batteries were a couple years old, wouldn't you want to put new batteries in it so it's ready to, when you need it? But as we've just heard from Dr. Spaulding, the batteries are doing just fine, thank you. We don't need new batteries. So anyway, that's what I would say. I can't think of any questions per se, but that would be kind of the context that I would, in terms of your comments.
All right, Dylan, you had a response?
Yeah, I think one of the questions that everyone can raise is what are the labs doing to protect the public, and how can they demonstrate that the measures they're taking are sufficient? There have been, as I mentioned on one of my slides, numerous criticisms from organizations like the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board that have analyzed the way in which LANL calculates potential off-site radiation exposure in the event of an accident, and those have been deemed insufficient in various ways. And I concur with a lot of those estimates in terms of the way that LANL assumes a serious accident could take place at the plutonium facility at Los Alamos. The criteria they use to estimate how much radiological material could be released. These are all things that are modeled in relatively sophisticated ways, but nonetheless they rely on assumptions that the public should not be bashful about pushing back on. And because some of those assumptions are questionable, in my opinion, quantitatively and qualitatively. And as I mentioned, LANL has been pushing back on some engineering controls, things like active confinement ventilation, which would help keep particulates in the building if there were a severe fire or something like that. It's systems like that that allowed releases at Rocky Flats. And that's not to say that PF4 could be another Rocky Flats. This is a very different, much smaller scale. But nonetheless, the choice to actively push back against it, I think, is something that the public should question, because that's an engineering control that can be put in place that would result in improved safety. That's the primary one I have for you.
Thank you both.
Okay, if that's it for questions for now from media.
Jay,
Yes.
sorry, I was on mute. It's Kay.
Okay.
I
Yes.
wanted to ask
Please
Dylan.
identify yourself, Kay.
It's Kay Matthews of La Jicarita, a publication, online publication in northern New Mexico on environmental politics.
Okay.
I wanted to ask Dylan a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, Dylan.
Hi.
We've known each other for many, many years. I'm really glad to see you. But anyway, if this is a rigged game, which it seemingly is, that this SWEIS is not addressing the fact that there was not an analysis of pit production, an adequate analysis of pit production before these site-wide environmental analysis were released, because there was nothing that analyzed what the consequences of pit production were. And now we have three alternatives that already accept the fact that pit production is going to proceed at Los Alamos. So how do we proceed as as the public and constituents to be part of the process when we know that like I said and Jay said, the game is already rigged? I mean, I think what you've said it's obvious that you think it's important to be on record, pushing the labs for safety and those issues. But again, the bottom line is that there's going to be pit protection at Los Alamos, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer to that question. I think it is very important to be on the record. And also I think it helps raise awareness of the parts of the EIS that are particularly objectionable and that have the biggest holes in them, particularly when it comes to worker protection and public protection, as well as the need for these programs. This is one place where we can put on record the fact that we see these programs as not only undesirable but unnecessary, certainly for national security, but because we already have a stockpile that has a lifetime of decades to come, even if you are in favor of nuclear deterrence, right? It is also true, as you sort of mentioned, that the NNSA and the labs have an unfortunate habit of documenting a number of alternatives in these EIS and then issuing amended records of decision after the fact, which is sort of a shell game in a way in terms of how they include considerations, as has been the case with pit production up to now. But it is still important, I think. These EIS do offer one of the most sort of transparent, holistic pictures of what the lab's plans are, which is valuable for the community of activists who can push back. And I don't know if Jay will address the fact that a judge recently found that NNSA has violated NEPA potentially through these past decisions. So sometimes this documentation can serve for future action as well. As unsatisfying as that may be as a response.
I want to reiterate, policy, federal policies are obviously very tough to deal with. But as I explained with respect to the 2000 Cerro Grande fire, there are very tangible benefits, safety benefits, which I would assert is reason enough to be involved in this process. So there's also the stupid quote, oatmeal beats no meal, but it's something. So again, I encourage people to get involved. Now I'm seeing 4 hands, now 5 hands raised, and we really need to move on. So unless you're media, we're going to have extensive Q&A, but unless you're media, please take your hands down now, and we shall move on. And I should have said in my introductory remarks, I personally always enjoy Q&A the most, and I will stay until there is no more Q&A. There's no timeline on Q&A. We can proceed until we're all exhausted. Okay, so having said that, I'm now going to turn it over to fellow NukeWatch staff member, Scott Kovac, and he's going to touch upon cleanup. It should be obvious to you all by now that this workshop really can only kind of scratch the surface. And I do want to point out, NukeWatch will have suggested comments up by February 25th that folks can use, adapt, whatever. The current deadline to submit written comments is March 11th, but that might be extended, so you might want to check our website. NukeWatch typically submits on the order of 30 plus pages for comprehensive comments, just to give you some kind of idea, but we certainly don't expect that out of you. But again, there'll be sample comments for your use. So turning it over to you, Scott Kovac, fellow NukeWatch staff member, addressing cleanup.
Thank you, Jay, and welcome everyone this evening. Appreciate you coming out. We'll just start with kind of an overview. At Los Alamos National Laboratory, the percentage spent annually on nuclear weapons programs is 79%. And that's, 79% of 5 billion approximately, gives us 4 billion. And cleanup's running around 200 million, 250 million, or around 200 million, which is around 6% of the total budget. And just, there's a little graph just showing the difference, how much, just to reiterate how much larger the weapons budget is and compared to the cleanup budget. Next. The site-wide EIS does not mention plans to cap and cover the wastes. They want to leave much of the waste behind. And the site-wide must analyze the impacts of leaving the waste behind. The picture here is one of the pits at Material Disposal Area G. And it's hard to say exactly, but I'm guessing that maybe there's 2 or 3 layers of boxes and drums below this, and they are going to fill this in with, this is from a while back, so they're going to fill this in, maybe 3 or 4 more layers of dirt, dirt waste, and just kind of stacking it up. So you'll notice that there's no liners. It's direct burial in soil, and there's no leachate collection system to monitor directly under the disposal area, and they're relying on boreholes and regional well monitors, which are being relied on to capture any waste that gets loose. Next. Cleanup has been repeatedly pushed back, most recently to 2043. And 2043 is an interesting year because that's 100 years since the first waste was dumped at Los Alamos Laboratory. And, the estimated cost is going to be at least $7 billion for the lab's version of cleanup, which includes mostly cap and cover on the larger disposal areas. And they plan to leave some 800,000 cubic yards of radioactive and hazardous waste in the unlined pits and shafts, as posing a perpetual threat to groundwater. The site-wide EIS must analyze the impacts of these disposal areas, which it doesn't do that well. Next. Thank you. It was starting in 2005, throughout the 90s, the lab was falsely claiming that groundwater contamination was impossible, mainly because they thought the tuff under the laboratory was impenetrable. But as early as 2005, the lab acknowledged that future contamination at additional locations is expected over a period of decades to centuries as more of the contamination inventory reaches the water table. The laboratory has become more and more a nuclear weapons production site. And LANL also is continuing to downplay the widespread plutonium contamination in soil, water, and plants. Cleanup must be a priority. Next. One of the current material disposal areas, Area C, is going to come up for public comment this year. MDAC was an 11.8 acre landfill with 7 disposal pits and 108 shafts. Most of the waste is buried from 10 to 25 feet below the original ground surface. 25 feet is, a pretty easy dig to excavate the waste. And the total waste in the pits is pushing 200,000 cubic meters. And the regional groundwater is approximately 1,300 feet below the ground surface. Contaminants have already reached the regional aquifer from MDAC. We will be asking for your help at an MDAC public hearing later on this year to support the New Mexico environments and their decision to excavate the waste in Area C. The New Mexico Environment Department has issued a draft order mandating comprehensive cleanup of Area C, which NukeWatch strongly supports. The lab and DOE adamantly oppose it. So we need to have our voices heard later on this year, and we'll keep you in touch with that. Next. The lab and Department of Energy will claim that material disposal area C is too contaminated to be excavated. Well, if it's too contaminated to be excavated, it must be too contaminated to be left behind. The lab's estimate for cap and cover of area C is 12 million. And we did a comparison of some other sites, namely MDA-B, which is actually completed. It was a 6-acre site that cost approximately 22.7 million per acre. The estimate for Area C excavation is 805 million for 11 acres, or 68 million per acre. And we just use those per acre numbers just to kind of give us an idea of, something similar that we can compare to, because they're quite different sites. We believe that the estimate is excessively high for excavation because the lab is against comprehensive cleanup. Costs must not be a reason to not clean up. The picture shows cleanup at MDA B in 2012 with an airtight enclosure, and the wastes were totally excavated. So this is a good example, and we know that they can do a good job on it.
Scott, excuse me, I'm jumping in, but I'm not seeing the slides, and I don't know if that's true of everybody else.
I see them.
Okay.
See them.
I see them.
Okay, good.
I see them.
Okay.
I see them.
Well, odd that I don't, but I'm glad to hear that. Okay, sorry, Scott.
Okay. Yes, next slide, please. Thank you, Sophie. Then there's also the chromium plume. This is kind of interesting because the lab is taking credit for remediation of the chromium plume in the no action alternative. I mean, that's where we find it, as if it's already been cleaned up or remediated. However, a recent independent technical review failed to reach a conclusion on a final remedy for the chromium plume. The review mentioned some chromium contamination. A small amount had migrated onto San Ildefonso Pueblo. At the present rate of pump and treat, it will take a century to remediate the lab's biggest environmental threat currently. The lab used chromium until about 1972, and the chromium was discovered in 2004 in Morton-Dad Canyon. Since 2004, the lab has been trying to figure out how to remediate the plume, and impacts of the chromium plume must be analyzed in the site-wide EIS. They're going ahead like it's already a done deal. The New Mexico standard for chromium in drinking water is 50 parts per billion, and the chromium that had reached onto San Ildefonso Pueblo is averaging around 5 parts per billion, but it is there, and it is, it's not zero, and it is cross the line onto San Ildefonso Pueblo. The DOE prepared a chromium final remedy environmental assessment in 2024 last year to evaluate the final remedy for the hexavalent chromium plume in Morton-Dad Canyon. Implementation of this final remedy included an element of the no action alternative as part of the environmental remediation. As such, the groundwater quality and let me try to explain this. They're taking credit for the remedy of the chromium plume having already taken place, when in fact their remedy is to decide what to do later. So they're relying on the fact that they can decide what to do later and not have to worry about it now, and just include it in the no action alternative, even though it hasn't really happened yet. I know it's kind of confusing, but so the final remedy relies on what is called adaptive site management, which is just a fancy name for figuring it out later. And the DOE has many instances of promising that there would be certain technologies available at other cleanup sites, and when the time came, the technologies were not available. So we need to analyze and continue analyzing in depth the chromium plume. Next. Genuine cleanup would be a win-win for northern New Mexicans, as it would permanently protect our environment and our water resources, and providing hundreds of high-paying jobs. Cleanup should be prioritized. And thank you. And we're going to move on to Sophie and her presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you, Scott. Great. So just kind of going off of what Scott was saying about the need for comprehensive cleanup at Los Alamos, I just wanted to briefly present this project we did last summer on mapping plutonium contamination and migration around Los Alamos lab. So we were looking at below ground data samples of plutonium 239, 240. And we took the data from a data set that is owned by Los Alamos, created by Los Alamos, called Intellis. But it's, over 100,000 data points. So we wanted to kind of distill that down and visualize that data and make it more comprehensive, more understandable. But the idea is to show the need for comprehensive cleanup. If you want to see more, there's a link. Our LANL cleanup page on our website has all of this info and more. So there's we mapped the contamination down into potentially the groundwater aquifer, as you can see here. And then there is this interactive map, which you can feel free to explore on your own, and it has different sediment and water and soil samples of and then there's a satellite view as well. So feel free to go explore and play with that map on our website. But this is also important because it kind of luckily had us get the interest of a scientist named Dr. Michael Ketter, who is on this call. Thank you for being here, Michael. And we actually went out and did some sampling with him last summer. So he is an independent scientist, chemist, and was able to take some samples in Acid Canyon in Los Alamos and independently analyze those. And what he found was pretty shocking, and it made headlines kind of all around the world. A lot of articles about this, a lot of sources picked it up. And his findings were that, so particularly in a water sample in Acid Canyon, one of the highest findings was a sample of 86 picocuries per liter. And just to put that into context, so New Mexico does not have an enforceable primary drinking water standard for plutonium 239-240. But the recommended guidance level for that is 1.5 picocuries per liter. So finding of 86 is really astounding and pretty scary. So we thank Dr. Michael Ketter for his work, and we will continue this work with him hopefully in the future. Colorado's enforceable water quality standard of plutonium 239-240 is 0.15 picocuries per liter. So we will keep working on that, and that is the goal, to implement something along those lines for New Mexico. Moving right along. So getting into the SWEIS now, there will be increased annual radioactive air emissions from the increased work at the lab, as you've heard Scott and Dylan discuss already. So as a result of expanding nuclear weapons research and production programs, the draft SWEIS states that there will be an increase in annual radioactive air emissions from 300 curies to approximately 2,750 curies per year. And that's not counting the 30,000 curies for the proposed tritium release, which I will get into in a minute here. But just that increase from 300 to 2,750 is over an 800% increase. That's significant, I would say. So, you know, we need to look at that. And you can see here just a table from the SWEIS, how they arrived at that 2,750 curies per year. Again, not counting the 30,000 curies for the tritium release. So this is in the SWEIS, and you can see those calculations here. And then just a note, in 1997, a federal judge ruled that the lab's radioactive air emissions were in gross violation of the Clean Air Act. And that was part of a lawsuit from concerned citizens for nuclear safety. But that my dad, a lawyer named John Stroud, was also involved in. So that's just a little personal note. I guess I'm kind of second generation here working on this stuff, so to speak. You know, watchdogging the lab, and the work never stops.
Brava.
Thank you. So this 30,000 curies business, The venting of the flamed tritium waste containers, FTWCs. This is a plan that the lab says they need to vent headspace gases from these flamed tritium waste containers, of which there are 4 at TA 54, Tech Area 54. So these headspace gases contain radioactive tritium. It's speculated that the tritium may be in the form of water vapor or elemental hydrogen gas. The plan is to vent them in place to remove the gases from the container before moving them to a separate facility for final disposition. The 4 FTWCs, waste containers, are estimated to contain some 114,000 curies total. And we knew that estimate before now, but the new information from the draft SWEIS is this 30,000 curies number. So the estimated curies for the estimated curies to be released for during the venting, we did not have that number for. We do now. It's could be up to the potential tritium releases associated with this project could be up to 30,000 curies, which would result in a potential offsite dose contribution to an individual of up to 8 millirem. The Clean Air Act sets a dose limit of 10 millirem per year to the public from airborne emissions of radionuclides. So the lab claims this will be a one-time event, but there are other tritium containers at other tech areas of the lab. So will there be future releases? The SWEIS is intended to analyze operations for the next 15 years, so that seems like something that should be analyzed in there. The really key issues with tritium exposure, as some of you may know, this is a very highly dangerous, potentially highly dangerous project because tritium can be very dangerous if inhaled. Similar to other forms of ionizing radiation, tritium has been shown to cause cancer, genetic mutations, birth defects, and a host of other adverse health effects. It's fundamental to note that there is no safe level of exposure. There's increased cancer risk at any level of exposure. And a significant amount of gaseous tritium will condense as tritiated water vapor, which can bioaccumulate, affecting egg cells and even crossing the placenta. So LANL needs to fully justify the need for this action and consider safer alternatives to the public. LANL, we need to press them to fully consider the health impacts to already burdened communities and seek alternatives to the proposed tritium venting. And by commenting on this, you can ensure that we are, helping protect the already burdened communities around this. And another issue in the SWEIS is that there is a proposed biosafety level 3 facility. So this proposal is in the expanded operations alternative, but that is actually the National Nuclear Security Administration's preferred alternative. So we're concerned about this. In 2002, and the National Nuclear Security Administration prepared an environmental assessment for the proposed construction and operation of a biosafety level 3 facility at Los Alamos. So LANL only operates at biosafety level 1 and 2 currently. Level 3 is above that, and level 4 is the highest. But it's not clear in the SWEIS why this is needed. A high security biolab and a secret nuclear weapons lab is a bad idea. They're working with dangerous pathogens, and we don't know what they would be. So we need to demand full justification and transparency for this plan. Why now? NukeWatch sued previously on this full environmental impact statement in 2004, and then LANL dropped the previous BSL-3 proposal. So why 2 decades later is this imperative? The draft site-wide EIS does not adequately explain the facility's purpose, risks, or mitigation strategies. So we need full transparency on what bioagents will be used and why. And I will go ahead and pass it along now to our Executive Director, Jay Coughlin.
Okay. And this will be the final issue. I want to first praise everybody for hanging in there. The evening's growing late. This is a bit of a fire hose of information, but nevertheless, still kind of only scratches the surface. So the final issue that we're going to address tonight, and again, I'll be brief, and we will get to Q&A, which I look forward to. But for people that are local to Santa Fe and northern New Mexico, most likely you're going to be aware of this new controversial proposal that is to run a new electrical transmission line across the area that's known as the Caja del Rio. So that's southwest of Santa Fe. And as you can see, the northwestern border of the Caja del Rio is the Rio Grande. So then that new transmission line would cross the Rio Grande across the very large valley, you might call it gorge, and hook up at Los Alamos. The ostensible purpose is to supply future electrical needs. So here you see a map, and it starts at the Norton substation, and then it crosses that U.S. Forest Service land, which is the Caja del Rio. The dotted lines are two existing transmission lines, and then it goes up to Los Alamos. Next slide, please, Sophie. Now, NukeWatch is a bit of a latecomer to this issue. And first, I got to say that we're just amazed that 24,000 comments were submitted by members of the public and organizations on both the NNSA's and the Forest Service's environmental assessments. And the Forest Service is involved because it has to grant right-of-way across its land for that transmission line. Now, LANL's increased electrical needs and its past needs have been surprisingly steady over the last couple of decades. But future needs or I will say anticipated needs, are being driven for supercomputers and artificial intelligence work that will inevitably have nuclear weapons applications. And I don't know about you all, but I'm kind of terrified of artificial intelligence and possible applications of AI to nuclear weapons command and control. I can cite 2 instances in which Soviet personnel used their intuitive hunches to think that radar was wrong and not start a all-out nuclear war. So I have a deep distrust of AI when it comes to potential applications to nuclear weapons command and control. But to weave this into the site-wide, to my surprise, and this again is under the preferred expanded operations alternative, but it is stated that a massive amount of solar arrays could be installed on lab property with the capacity of up to 159 megawatts. And it's also stated in the same paragraph that that would defer nearly 2 billion in quote social costs of greenhouse gases over 15 years. So this information, this alternative was not disclosed. in the lesser environmental assessments that both NNSA and the Forest Service did. And I would contend that that actually violates the National Environmental Policy Act, where all relevant information should be disclosed and evaluated, especially when it comes to credible alternatives. And, to conclude, as I put it, simply put, future solar arrays make the highly controversial transmission line, known. It has this jargon of electrical power capacity upgrade, but it makes that controversial transmission line simply not necessary. And to go back to the fact, and something that, again, I'm amazed about, there were 24,000 opposing comments. And it really is an unusual coalition of, first of all, the tribes, especially Tasuki Pueblo, objecting to this transmission line across the Caja del Rio. It is also Hispanic community leaders and call it the typical environmentalists or whatever. So again, according to this new information, this new transmission line is simply not needed, and alternatively, LANL could install and speed up, if needed, the installation of these solar arrays. And Sophie, this is just to remind folks, let's go back to that slide about the pending hearings and how to comment. We'll pause just a moment so that folks can note that down if they want to. Again, I want to thank people for hanging in there. I know it gets tough to sit in a chair and look at a computer this long, but thank you very much. I want to encourage, again, your participation both at the hearings and in the submission of comments. Again, there will be sample comments available up until, we'll get sample comments up for your use and adaptation by February 25th. Now we can move into Q&A. I'll say again, I'm prepared to stay until there are no more questions. I'm going to ask people to raise hands. Sophie's going to call on people, but I want to do one person a favor, in part because of his experience. And the other part is, I know he's in the Eastern time zone. So let's see, it's 7 o'clock our time. Now it's 9 o'clock his time. But Jim Warner, I want to call on you first and for a question. And I want to introduce you, first of all, as a formal engineer for the national organization, the Natural Resources Defense Council. And then he was also a high-level advisor to the DOE Secretary on Environmental Management back under the Clinton administration. And to praise Jim, he authored and led a team that came up with the best inventories that DOE has ever done on its waste. So, Jim, if you're there.
I don't think he is anymore, unfortunately.
Okay, that's unfortunate. Yeah, I guess, see, it's late back east. Okay, with that, then Sophie, I'm going to leave it to the roll of the dice, and you just call on people for questions.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do Tom. Thanks for your patience. And you're on mute.
Thanks for catching that.
If you have questions for specific presenters, please say so, and please self-identify.
Tom Lubin here. I'm a tribal attorney. I do some environmental work, but I can't claim great expertise on NEPA. And my question is to either Dr. Spaulding or anyone who might have the expertise or an idea how to answer this question. And it's just this. So far as I know, and I think Dr. Spaulding confirms this, the only justification that's been given for the nuclear weapons modernization program has been pit aging. And let me just as a preliminary question say, is that correct?
I can answer that first question. I think that's partially correct. It's NNSA often cites pit aging as one of the leading reasons for pursuing pit production now, and for the reason we need to do it now. And their rationale is that we should not wait until we discover a potentially fatal flaw in plutonium, but that we should have the ability to produce plutonium pits in case we do. And as I mentioned in my presentation, as far as the science shows so far, at least what we can tell from the unclassified literature, there's no evidence that there's a problem now. And from the accelerated aging studies, which I mentioned, which simulate a faster rate of radioactive decay, they essentially speed up the aging in plutonium. Those don't show deleterious effects either, even for plutonium with simulated ages, effective ages of 150 years. So it doesn't look like there's evidence that aging is an urgent reason to pursue production now. And again, what is driving the demand right now is the desire to roll out new warheads for the ICBMs and the submarines. So if the US chose not to pursue those new warhead programs, we would not need pit production for the current stockpile for decades.
So you, up to now, the only reason I've understood was publicly given was pit aging. And Dr. Spaulding, you're indicating that it's publicly it's publicly a position of NNSA that one of the purposes is the new warheads and the new missile. But there's a little narrative here. We had a town hall meeting in Santa Fe a year or two ago. I'm trying to think. I think actually it was a year ago, April, where Jill Ruby, an NSA administrator, appeared and made a presentation. And I asked her at that meeting what the justification is for nuclear weapons modernization program. And she made what I found to be a very interesting statement and an extravagant statement. She just flat said that deterrence won't work without the nuclear weapons modernization program. I did not get a follow-up question when there was a second town hall meeting, which I also attended up at Buffalo Thunder facility. I submitted that question in advance online, and that was never answered. I had a subsequent conversation with Representative Melanie Stansbury, where I narrated or I explained this experience I had had with Jill Ruby, and I asked her, Melanie Stansbury, because and everyone should know this, Melanie Stansbury has said that she opposes the pit production facility. We've asked her to go public with that. She has not done so and said that's because of comity in the New Mexico congressional delegation. We can't get Teresa Leger Fernandez to say anything about it. In any event, I asked Melanie Stansbury what could be the basis for Jill Ruby saying that deterrence, just flatly saying that deterrence won't work without the nuclear weapons modernization program. Stansbury said that.
Tom, we need to be concise, please.
Okay, I'm working on it. Stansbury said that she had been confidentially briefed and that there was a reason I also had a subsequent conversation with a professor from University of New Mexico who indicated the same thing. And so that gets to my question. What reason could there be other than the two reasons that Dr. Spaulding has identified? Is there some secret here that Melanie Stansbury has been told that is not public?
Yeah, I can address that. There's an important distinction that I didn't talk about between plutonium aging and primary aging. And I think the primary stage in the nuclear weapon is not just plutonium. It includes other metals, the explosive part around it. And as I explained, up until now, the national labs have been maintaining the stockpile we have through a program of sort of continual refurbishment. They call them life extension programs for specific warheads. And that's been done through the stockpile stewardship program. The issue of the distinction between primary aging and pit aging means that there could be components within a primary that have a shorter lifespan than the plutonium does. And therefore, there could be certain warhead designs that NNSA is concerned about that may have, life-limiting components in them that limit their shelf life to, say, 60 years, 70 years, instead of the 85 to 100 that I cited for plutonium. With that said, the core of the pit production program is to purify and recast and remachine new plutonium components to rebuild those primaries from scratch. And I personally believe that unless the plutonium is the problem, you don't need to do that, that the labs could deal with other issues within the primaries, if indeed they have a shorter lifespan, through the kind of refurbishments that they've been conducting up until now. I don't agree with the statement that deterrence won't work if they don't modernize. And part of the reason for that is because, the labs have often touted the scientific capabilities of the stockpile stewardship program as a form of deterrence itself. And that by demonstrating cutting edge technology and by demonstrating leading scientific facilities, that in fact the US was signaling that they know how to do this stuff and that they know how to do it well, and that other nations would not question the reliability of our nuclear arsenal, given the public visibility that the stockpile stewardship program provided. And that could be done without developing new weapons, right? And so paradoxically, that's kind of led to an arms race of scientific facilities instead of warheads. But now we're swinging back in the other direction, where instead of limiting ourselves to the science and refurbishment, we are building new.
Well, the reason I thought that Administrator Ruby's statement was extravagant was because the stockpile maintenance program is supposed to be maintaining the deterrence capability of the stockpile, and her response suggested that the stockpile maintenance program isn't working. Now, that said, I have other questions, but I'm going to defer those to let other folks ask questions.
I have one thing I want to add while we're on pit production, but it is known that the pit designs and the manufacturing process is being changed. We know the manufacturing process is being substantially changed. We know that designs are being changed as well, but we don't know to what extent. The point I'm reaching for is those new plutonium pits cannot be full-scale tested because of the existing global testing moratorium. So arguably, this pit production is diminishing, eroding confidence in the stockpile. But then the alternative is the US starts testing again, which Trump's former national security advisor has already argued for. So the alternative is, because of new pit designs, the US goes back to testing, which would have incalculable global proliferation consequences. So that's my little interjection. Sophie, if we could go on to the next question, please.
Yeah, I don't see it anymore, but Greg, if you still have a question, go ahead. although I don't see your hand anymore.
Oh, I was just I took my hand down because it's actually off topic, but maybe somebody in this meeting has a place where I can get information about the so I'm convinced by things you guys have all said that it's bullshit that this is needed for nuclear just extending the life of these pits. So I want to know, what is the geopolitical strategy going on here that's really driving this arms race? And I don't need somebody to tell me that answer to that question. Just where on the internet or in the library can I find, a good analysis of the think tanks or whoever who are driving this fear, I guess you could say.
You want to address that, Dylan, or I'll give it a shot?
Yeah, there are a number of motivations. At Union of Concerned Scientists, we have a group who's focused solely on East Asia. And China is one of the big concerns now. They're believed to be expanding their nuclear arsenal. And in 2021, it was revealed that they had built missile silo fields. That's something that raised obviously huge concern in Washington, D.C. And then the situation in Ukraine, of course, with Russia, and uncertainty with Iran. Of course, Israel is an unacknowledged, they don't acknowledge their possession of nuclear weapons, but it's widely believed they have them. And so the conflict there also raises concern. So I think the geopolitical instability is causing a lot of that. We have some references on the UCS website I can point you to if you want to send me an email. But I think the downside of that is that it's often said that no one wins a nuclear arms race, and I think that's even more true when it's a three-way potential arms race, um, which is something that we should all pay attention to.
Okay, thanks.
And again, I'll add, the very word deterrence needs examination. And the US and the Soviet Union and now Russia have never had just deterrence. And it's always been a mix of deterrence and nuclear warfighting capabilities, which is why we have thousands of deployed weapons instead of just a few hundred. And I would offer as proof what's called a nuclear implementation plan that follows the president's nuclear posture review. And the first document is a Pentagon document. But in 2013, after the Obama's nuclear posture review, the Pentagon's nuclear implementation plan explicitly rejected what it called minimal deterrence and said we're going to follow a policy, and this is nuclear weapons jargon, but we're going to follow a policy of counterforce, which means nuclear warfare, essentially. The second thing I was going to point out, NukeWatch and a couple of other organizations were involved in litigation over having a programmatic environmental impact statement on pit production. And we had some opposing declarations. One of them was from the commander of strategic forces that was really kind of over the top and saying if we don't have immediate pit production, we're going to lose our deterrence. Another declaration, and all of this, is under oath. Another declaration was by the head of nuclear weapons programs within NNSA. And he said we needed to have immediate pit production because of aging, plutonium aging, which I think Dylan just destroyed. But the other thing I want to point out, he said, we need new pit production for new military requirements. And he did not say what those requirements are. But I believe that leads to an endless parade of new nuclear weapons designs and is essentially a mandate for nuclear weapons forever, all of which leads to the spiraling arms race that is very, very dangerous and growing worse. So, end of my comments. Let's go ahead, Sophie. Go to Jessica Aberly.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jessica Aberly. I also am a tribal attorney, and I have a comment question for Dr. Spaulding. I really appreciate your pointing out where the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board critiques are being disregarded. I think that's a really important issue. But my question is, will a union of concerned scientists also be helping analyze specific human health risk modeling assumptions that are questionable? Because the document, if you look at the SWEIS, is replete with language about how conservative all the assumptions are and how protective they are of human health. And it really takes a technical expert to help kind of parse through garbage in, garbage out. And will there be, is that something that UCS can help do in terms of some of those assumptions? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We would love to help, particularly people that are looking out for the tribes, to do that. So if you can get in touch, we can answer specific questions. The report that Jay mentioned also specifically addresses the assumptions that go into releases from the plutonium facility in particular.
And let's go to Francis Hatfield.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm really, thank you for putting this on. I've been wanting to get active on this issue for a long time. I was at Buffalo Thunder and I was at a meeting last year, and it's dismaying to me how little it seems like anybody's listening to all the comments and what's happening. So my question is about strategy. I want to get active, and I understand that going to these meetings and doing the public comments is very important. That's what you're stressing. And beyond that, what can you say about other kinds of action that can be effective, and how effective in sort of descending order, like letters to the editor or letters to Congress people? Do they have any say over any of this? Or what other kind of strategies are there that I could think about when I've had a chance to digest all this some of this information and figure out what I want to be advocating, especially for, which I think right now would be the environmental effects, local, our state, and environmental effects and health effects. So anyway, what other strategies are there?
I'll take a crack at that, if I may. First of all, none of us should overlook the mundane. And by that, I mean things such as something you already mentioned, letters to the editor. And I used to go to Washington 3 to 4 times a year prior to COVID. Now I don't go that much, but somewhere back there in ancient history, one of the staff members of the New Mexican congressional delegation told me that every day they go looking at letters for the editor and they count them. And then they actually extrapolate and say, well, if 5 people write a similar or a letter to the editor on the same issue, then it must be really important to, the rest of the New Mexican population. So I have always felt letters to the editor are important, although I don't write them as often as I should. But I encourage you to do so. Then, I'm going to say that we have an absolutely wonderful New Mexican congressional delegation. They are so wonderful on everything except nuclear weapons programs. And they're always looking to shovel money to the labs. And this is particularly true of Martin Heinrich, who I like to call the congressional Darth Vader of hip production. And it's also true of Ben Ray Lujan. And then our representatives basically follow them. But it's critical that, and speaking of Martin Heinrich, he hasn't met with me or any anti-nuclear weapons activist group that I know of since he's been in the Senate, despite being asked year after year. So the last time I've seen him face to face was when he was still in the House. So that's at least 14 years. These guys need to feel more pressure. And they, I know this comes as a shock to you, but they're politicians. They follow what they think their constituents want, and there's simply not enough of an opposing voice. And one way to manifest that is through comment at both the hearings and submitted comment to the site-wide. So we got to face the fact that we're in it for the long game. There's no question about it. And I just wish the Archbishop could wave his magical spiritual wand and change things around overnight. But sadly, John, it's not going to happen, right? We're in it for the long haul, and it takes this legwork, and it takes getting after it. Now, I want to end on a motivational note, though, is both John and I, and Archbishop John, and we talked about this just the other day. Both of us believe in the divinity of all things, including the human race. And I'm speaking only for myself, but our job as anti-nuclear weapons activists is to help protect the human race's potential to actually fully realize its divine capacity. The alternative is radioactive hell. That's what it is. So, I run around, I'm eclectic. I quote the Grateful Dead, I quote Shakespeare, whatever. But to quote Shakespeare, we brave few doing this work. To quote Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, somebody's got to make it right, and it's pathetic that it's us. So we're in it for the long term.
Thank you.
And Cynthia Wheeler, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cindy Wheeler, and I am a volunteer who's kind of ad hoc with a lot of different organizations, primarily the 285 Alliance. And Francis, you made me want to say something, and this is to everybody, but just a couple of people and myself are working on a campaign. We've been working on the WIP issue for a long time. And what I think is we've narrowed down is probably the most immediate thing that needs to be done is to look at getting this extra legacy waste off the mountain at LANL because of the danger of wildfires to everyone, to the public. And we think that it's winnable because it's part of the permit and the DOE agreed to it. And so that's kind of the first step that we're taking. And we're organizing a campaign around satire and around taking the things that the DOE does and LANL does and the WIP people do that just it makes them look as inept as they are. And we're trying to make it funny because that's usually the best way to get people to pay attention. And this is going to be something we're working on for quite a while. We're hoping in the next few months to have something, but I just wanted to let you know if you're interested and you'd like to get in contact with me, I put my email in the chat, and it's 285alliance@gmail.com. And when we've got something together, we'd like to have it spread far and wide. So that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Cindy. Tom, I do see your hand. If there's anyone else who hasn't asked a question.
Yeah. Yes, Sophie, I have another matter, and that's this. I am working on a challenge to an environmental impact statement on a certain project, and I have an expert witness who is preparing a psychosocial impact study. And in this instance today, we're talking about the adequacy of the draft environmental impact statement. And I think that I will make a comment and take a position that the final environmental impact statement must include a psychosocial impact study of the psychosocial impact of the pit production on all of the surrounding communities. And I just wondered if anybody with more experience and expertise in NEPA litigation has any comment about that.
I do. And federal agencies are actually required by the National Environmental Policy Act to study socioeconomic issues, which I think could be stretched to what you said. I forget your exact term, but psychological issues or whatever.
Psychosocial.
Yeah. So there's a definite requirement to study socioeconomic issues and, as Dylan pointed out, environmental justice issues. Now, there's only so many issues we could present upon in this workshop. So I'll say a couple of, just orally, a couple of relevant sub-issues under socioeconomic issues. It's already known that housing costs are going up because the lab has hired 4,000 new employees over the last couple of years. Cost of living is going up. Another factor that I really want to impress upon you all, there is what I view as this constant DOE economic propaganda coming out. And this is a Census Bureau fact. And if you look for it on our website, if you did a search, you could find it. But the per capita income for the state of New Mexico has gone down. This is relative to all the other states, has gone down from 34th in 1959 to 47th in 2022. And to me, that runs counter to the DOE economic propaganda. At the same time, New Mexico is rated dead last in quality of public education and the quality of life for children. Plus, we have the most children living in poverty. And the final little factoid I'll mention now, and there are many others. This is not generally known, but the 6 county governments surrounding Los Alamos County suffer a net economic loss from the lab. And that is services rendered to lab employees who then commute to the lab or work remotely, services rendered, the typical fire, police, roads, etc. But the cost of services rendered for lab employees who commute or work remotely is greater than what those counties receive back in taxes. And that comes from an arm of the University of New Mexico called the Bureau of, Business and Economic Research. So again, New Mexicans are fed this constant stream of DOE and laboratory economic propaganda, and that needs to be contested because I see them saying outrageous things. And even in Nuclear Watch's experience, back in 2002, we challenged LANL's claimed economic multipliers, where one lab dollar created $3 in the general economy. We challenged that, and they quit saying it. But my point is, this is yet another issue in the site-wide that deserves a lot of analysis and challenging are the socioeconomic issues. And this goes to the overarching question of what good does the nuclear weapons industry really do for New Mexicans outside of the privileged nuclear weapons enclaves?
Is there a socioeconomic study in the DEIS?
They address socioeconomic issues, also environmental justice issues. First of all, I must confess, I haven't looked at them deeply as of yet. I'm familiar with what they've done in past site-wides. It is not adequate. One interesting thing that they do say in these site-wides, they define a 50-mile radius region of influence. That's what they call it. And the demographics of the population within that 50-mile radius, let's see, I'm trying to remember the exact amount. It was in the 60s. I think it was 68%. So it's 68% Hispanic and Native American. That's the demographic. Los Alamos County itself is 81% non-Hispanic Caucasian, and it is the 11th richest county in the US in terms of median household income, literally next to some of the poorest communities in the United States, San Ildefonso and Santa Clara Pueblos and Espanola and Rio Arriba County. So there's very serious socioeconomic and environmental justice issues, which we didn't really address tonight. But thank you for your question, Tom, and for the opportunity to bring this up. I've been doing this
I have
too
additional.
long. Just got my head crammed of all this stuff.
I have some additional points and questions, but again, I'll defer for others.
Yeah, I wanna encourage people to ask questions. Don't be shy. One reason that I like questions so much is by definition, it lets us know what you're really interested in. And, we would answer your questions to the best of our ability. So do please ask questions. I'm not yet beat. I can go on some.
Yeah, Leah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this. Just the facts that you're putting together, it's so amazing. Thank you so much. I'm presently in a book club at World Beyond War, and we are reading Nuclear is Not the Solution by, I think, M.V. Ramana. And it's just the first chapter, it says basically nuclear technology is a really toxic way to boil water. And just hearing your all like, the data, it just really shows what a wasteful, strange, technology that we got stuck in, that I look forward to the day after remediation is complete. My question is for Dylan. I would love to just hear, I'm so interested that you had worked at the labs. And if you're interested to share, I'm just curious, when did you go from shock engineer to a Union of Concerned scientist?
That's a good question. It's probably too long an answer to give here, but I'm also a New Mexico native, and that has a big part of it. I grew up in between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, in between Sandia and Los Alamos. And so the socioeconomic dichotomy that we're talking about, the economic state of New Mexico, has always been palpable. And, I grew up in the communities that are affected. So um, there's the balance of cutting edge science, and there's the balance of justice for people that bear the brunt of it, right? So I'm glad to be doing this work now.
But Leah, I want to recommend two books to you. And the book you mentioned is more on nuclear power and not weapons. But on weapons, read the book by Daniel Ellsberg. And of course, he was the famous Pentagon Papers whistleblower. But it's called The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And I'm making fun of Archbishop Wester, but he told me how he was reading that book on a plane. And I guess his body language was one of alarm, and he was scaring the passenger next to him. But it's that kind of book. It's really good. And this gets to the question I raised about deterrence. And the other book that I recommend is called Nuclear War by Annie Jacobson. And that was a recent New York Times bestseller. But boy, those two books, whoa, they lay it out on the line.
I've listened to these on audiobook. I'm not finished with Annie Jacobson's,
Yeah.
but one thing she mentions Iran, but Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, but Israel does. And that's one more thing that's, I think, not talked about enough, but perhaps, for another conversation. Thank you.
More questions?
Beata, go ahead.
Hi, thank you everyone for this.
Right?
Yeah, my name is Beata Sosi, and I had a few questions. One was, why did the DOE not want to excavate Area C? Just for starters on that one.
Yeah, okay. I have a very succinct answer for you. And because there's various reasons that I can't give you a source, okay? But they're worried about the impact that comprehensive cleanup of Area C might have on what they call the mission. And then I asked, well, I'm of this philosophy, don't ask a question unless you already know the answer. So I knew the answer. What is the mission? And they go, well, it's plutonium pit production. And the reason why is because MDAC is located just a few hundred yards from PF4, which is the plutonium pit production facility. And Scott and I were told that a couple thousand employees walk by every day from a parking lot to PF4. So they're actually worried about the practical impacts that full cleanup of Area C could have. Now, more broadly, I can tell you they are adamantly opposed to dig up one shovelful of waste. There's one exception. There's so-called buried retrievable true at Area G that when they buried it, they knew they were going to dig it back up. And Scott, that's something like 8,000 cubic meters. Is it that much? Versus there's actually 800,000 cubic yards of total waste at the laboratory. So Los Alamos, its raison d'etre is nuclear weapons. And they're never going to get off of that until they're shut down someday. And cleanup to them, first of all, is not sexy. It just isn't. And at least in my view, they want as much money as they can get for their nuclear weapons programs. And there's a fear that cleanup programs could drain that large. They're spending $4 billion a year now on nuclear weapons programs, and cleanup programs are around $220 million a year. And they certainly don't want any competition between the two. So, Beata, that's my not so short answer on the other thing too. This is why NukeWatch is taking cleanup of Area C so seriously. We believe that it's going to be a model for cleanup of the rest of the lab. And the lab doesn't even want to go there. Doesn't even want to start with one shovel of waste at Area C. All of which I'll note is on your, Beata, on your ancestral lands. So.
Yeah, no, I'm very aware. The other question I had was on the hexavalent chromium plume. Is there some kind of like legal, I don't know, what the word is, recourse to that they developed a remediation plan without knowing the full extent of the plume? Because they just found out that it was going into Sanai lands recently, correct?
Yes. You want to address that, Scott?
Sure. Hi, Beata. First off, if it's not above 50 parts per billion, they don't consider it contaminated. So the lower contamination, like the 5 parts per billion that's crossing the line into San Ildefonso, doesn't count as contamination in their book, which is wrong. I mean, it's there. It's five. It's it is contamination. I don't. I'm sorry, Beata. What was your other question?
I guess just how are they allowed to develop a plan of remediation without knowing how big the plume was?
Right. A plan of right. They signed off on the remedy. They've chosen the final remedy, which is site. It's a ASM, alternative adaptive site management. So they call it adaptive site management, which is just an idea to do whatever they think they need to do later. So they don't really have a plan. They have a plan to get a remedy, but they don't even have a remedy. And you're right, as part of that not having a remedy, they don't even know how big the plume is. At this point, they still need to drill some more wells. So I'm not sure if there's a legal recourse or not, but they believe that they've uh, acted and answered all the NEPA questions, the National Environmental Policy Act questions that they need to, and they've satisfied themselves that uh, it's all okay.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
The other
Beata,
last comment I had was
let me add though, Beata, while we're still on chromium and crossing the tribal boundary. 2 years ago, the Archbishop and I were out there at the San Ildefonso feast day. The Archbishop gave mass, and as the Archbishop was walking back to his car, one of the tribal leaders, and I didn't catch his name, and I'm more or less quoting this from memory, but verbatim. He said, "Boy, it's lucky that the chromium contamination stops at our boundary. And if we ever find out different, it'll be a whole new ball game." And so again, to my memory, that's a verbatim quote. I say that, Beata, um, just, this is somewhat rhetorical, but it sure would be great if San Ildefonso tribal leadership really got serious about the chromium contamination that has crossed onto San Ildefonso land.
on that note, what would be the implications for the SWEIS if a tribe did invoke their water quality standards?
Was that a question?
I guess, yeah. So like if they were to invoke water quality standards for
Yes.
chromium that were
Yes.
were, I don't know, 0 parts per million,
Yes.
would that influence cleanup?
Well, you know better than I. The Pueblos are sovereign governments. And, the Pueblos don't necessarily have to care about this and that standard. As sovereign governments, if they so chose to do so, they could really bring a lot of pressure on LANL, and in particularly San Ildefonso Pueblo, since it is both downstream and downwind. There is voluminous documentation of plutonium migrating through Los Alamos Canyon on San Ildefonso land to the Rio Grande and to Cochiti Lake. So again, the Pueblos could have a lot of power on this if they chose to exercise it. There's actually a case in point where Isleta Pueblo, downstream of Albuquerque, forced the city of Albuquerque to build a new expensive wastewater treatment facility because of contaminants that the city of Albuquerque was sending to the Rio Grande. So there is precedent for it.
Can I comment?
Concisely, Tom, yes.
I think it would be incredibly powerful if San Ildefonso adopted water quality standards, which required lower chromium and other contaminants coming onto the Pueblo lands than is in fact happening, and then undertook litigation to enforce those requirements, just as Sandia Pueblo did.
I think it was Isleta that did, Tom.
Excuse me, I misspoke.
Yeah, Isleta.
Concise enough, Jay?
Yeah. Just for those who don't know, Isleta is south and therefore downstream of Albuquerque. Sandia is immediately north of Albuquerque and hence upstream. More
One final question. This is Beata still.
Mhm.
So regarding the three dismal choices for plans or the alternate plans, is it okay if we comment not in support of any of them?
Well, there's no comment police.
But like, is it just they won't be like
Dismissed?
Yeah.
You know, I personally am going to write comments that I know will be dismissed. They won't be, I will say some of my comments. And you know that NNSA is going to automatically dismiss any talk about how the Los Alamos lab and NNSA in general is fueling the new nuclear arms race. But I'm going to say that. And I encourage you all to say that because it's the truth. And it should be said. So I'm answering your question by telling you at least what I'm going to do. And we're not presented with that many tools. And when we have one, we have to use it the best we can. And so this site-wide EIS is a highly imperfect tool, but I do think we ought to use it to the best of our ability.
Ending his own life.
Elizabeth, go ahead.
Hello. Let's see. I think, is it Beata? What a beautiful name. I think if you or your community spoke up about water standards, based on your sovereign nation, it would make incredible news in the paper. Right now, people are fascinated by what Native American voices have to say in their variety. And I really enjoyed hearing you bring up comments, and I think it would be very, very powerful, especially hitching it up to water standards that evidently our state is slow to be strict about. Thank you.
Okay, who you got, Sophie?
Oh, Jean, go ahead. And you're on mute. Go ahead and unmute if you could.
Okay, I was just going to say to Beata and other people too that, there's a lot of people who give technical testimony, but I think it's also important, especially with what we were talking about, the psychosocial part of it, to go ahead and give them our emotions too, because they need to hear that. They need to hear that nuclear weapons are immoral. They need to hear a lot of that stuff. So, I would just urge people, don't be afraid to speak if you don't feel like you're real knowledgeable about all the stuff. Just speak anyway. We need lots of people, voices out there, and yeah. Anyway, that's what I had to say. Thank you.
And then if we don't have anyone else, Tom, go ahead.
Okay, this question is for Jay, and I'm afraid it reveals my lack of getting in depth into this the way that I would like to. But NEPA requires environmental impact statements as a decision-making document. And I've long been wondering how it is that preparation and construction for the pit production facility has been proceeding without the SWEIS. Presumably the SWEIS is the decision-making document, and the alternative to build the pit production factory is supposed to be a decision made after the SWEIS has been completed. So how is it that it's going forward without legal challenge at this point?
Well, I'm going to add to your dismal assessment and take it one step even further back. And first of all, there should have been a new programmatic, which is to say nationwide environmental impact statement on plutonium pit production. And that is what NukeWatch, Savannah River Site Watch in South Carolina, and Tri-Valley Cares in Livermore, California. That's what we sued over. And we did get a ruling from a federal judge that NNSA was in violation of the National Environmental Policy Act. But, Tom, you're a lawyer. And, the old saying, 90% of the law is possession. How do you stop a federal agency with the immense resources that it has? I'll tell you what the proper NEPA world should have been is that there was a new programmatic nationwide environmental impact statement, especially when they decided in 2018 to have production at two sites, that being Los Alamos and the Savannah River site. From there, the Los Alamos site-wide EIS should have followed. The NEPA term is the site-wide should have been tiered off of the programmatic. Tiered is TIER, tiered based off of the programmatic. And then it gets down to finer levels of detail with specific NEPA processes for specific projects. But Department of Energy NEPA land is Alice in Wonderland. It's all upside down. They essentially have infinite resources in terms of taxpayers' money, which goes to their lawyers. And they have been habitual offenders going back to the 1980s. And you ask the question of how do they get away with it? Well, they get away with it because they're rich with taxpayers' money. And all of this is while the New Mexican congressional delegation very much supports them. So they got their political ducks in a row as well. And, I can speak for only NukeWatch, but we do the best we can. And what's important is to really elevate this issue to the point where it has some political impact on our own congressional delegation. So I have urged you to be succinct a couple of times. There is my own not so succinct answer that's less than direct. But, again, DOE, Department of Energy, NEPA land is Alice in Wonderland. It's upside down. And unfortunately, they get away with this stuff. And it's up to us citizens to stop them.
I have had conversations about potential litigation to enjoin pit production pending completion of an adequate environmental impact statement. And am I correct then, Jay, that the reason that the available plaintiffs, shall we say, or potentially available plaintiffs, have not mounted that kind of attack is because we lack the resources. It would be a big piece of litigation, very complicated, time-consuming, expensive. Am I correct then that we haven't done it because we just don't have the horses?
Well, now we're talking like lawyers, and I'll emphasize again, I'm only a wannabe lawyer. You got a big problem even in front of that, besides the resources question. And we ran into it in our litigation. And the big problem is there is a specific statutory requirement, and that was in it started in the 2015 Defense Authorization Act, and it became more absolute in the 2019 and 2000 and the 2020 Defense Authorization Act. But there is a statutory requirement that Los Alamos produce at least 30 pits per year. And they're already past the deadline. And some of you might recall, and I even saw some smirks when I said it, I called Martin Heinrich the Darth Vader, the congressional Darth Vader of pit production, because it was he and Lindsey Graham of South Carolina that went on to create a statutory requirement that at least 80 pits per year be produced between Los Alamos and the Savannah River site. But I mean, I'm going to assume that a lot of you will start to get the picture that when Congress says something direct in a statute, you're not going to be able to overcome that. And what do you do? And by the way, in our litigation, there was a constant underlying threat that, first of all, the Department of Energy, if we didn't have a settlement, first of all, they were going to appeal in the Fourth Circuit, which is South Carolina. Fourth Circuit is generally regarded as the second worst circuit in the United States, Texas being even worse. And they were threatening to take it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it revolved around those statutory requirements I just told you about. So, I hate to say anything's kind of a showstopper, but that one statute is a problem. Now, LANL's ability to do it is another matter, and especially to do it safely.
Jean, go ahead. Oh, and go ahead and unmute, please.
So there's no way to get rid of a statutory thing? I mean, we've got people in the White House right now who are tearing down a whole bunch of stuff. Is there no way that they can't rescind that as well, or you know what I mean?
Well, I'm going to say politically, no way.
No way. So it's like a law. It's like a.
Oh, that when I say it's a statute, yes, it's a law.
It's a law.
Yeah, and if you tried to overturn it again, maybe I didn't make it clear enough. We got a Supreme Court. If you manage to overturn somehow that statute in a lower court, they are definitely going to take it to the U.S. Supreme Court if they have to take it that far. And you know as well as I what that means with present Supreme Court.
What if they withheld the money?
I had an additional comment, but I didn't want to interrupt whomever was also speaking.
Go.
Beata also has her hand up. I don't know if you question. Go ahead.
I could go. Thank you. Is there any existing analysis for how this expanded pit production would impact uranium mining sites and waste production or waste disposal sites outside of the LANL boundaries? Just thinking about what this means for our relatives from Havasupai and other areas where they're already dealing with increased uranium mining and mines getting opened back up.
Yeah.
Is there any way to connect the dots in this process with those things happening, or is there any work being done to gauge what those impacts would be if these options get passed?
Beata, I'm going to say no. And the reason is because the US government already has too much plutonium and, in fact, is trying to get rid of 40 metric tons of it that it deems excess. And that's an example of another issue that we did not touch in the site-wide, but it wants to, first of all, process that plutonium at Los Alamos, send it to the Savannah River site for so-called dilution, and then send it to WIPP for disposal. But bottom line is the US already has too much plutonium. And so uranium mining, this renewed uranium mining is not weapons related. It is nuclear energy related.
I did have another question.
Let's go ahead with Leah first, if you don't mind, Tom.
Sure, just to piggyback on that, I from reading Nuclear is Not the Solution, I learned that also nuclear energy is like a front for nuclear weapons. Like nuclear energy is almost like the excuse, like the sleight of hand for the deception that this is at all any sort of functional technology for humanity.
Listen, I'm just jumping in. The Archbishop tells me he has to go now. I just want to thank you, Archbishop. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. God bless now. Thanks for everything.
We very much appreciate it.
Very
Bye.
helpful. Good night.
Thank you, Archbishop.
Okay, Leah, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no. I said what I needed to. That's all.
Could you repeat it, please?
Sure. That nuclear energy is like a front for nuclear weapons. It's like an excuse to allow nuclear weapon, all of this. And some war contractors are making money from this, right? Like, I wonder, Lindsey Graham, if he's just a Christian Zionist to believe that we need all this, like, what's his motivation? It's so shocking to learn that law. I'm just in shock right now.
Well, I'll tell you what his motivation is on pit production. It's called money. It's
right. Yeah.
It's nuclear pork. That's what it is. And that's, as I pointed out already, that's why Heinrich and Lindsey Graham were co-sponsors of a provision in the 2020 Defense Authorization Act to make at least 80 pits per year a physical requirement. Prior to that, it was just to demonstrate the capability to produce 80 pits per year. But Lindsey Graham and Martin Heinrich made it just make it, period. It's going to be at least 80 pits per year.
It's insane. Maybe I could follow up with you to write about that.
Yes.
Thanks.
And email to info@nukewatch.org. INFO. info@nukewatch.org. I'd like to point out too, for those who are interested, we do have a fact sheet on plutonium pit production at our website, nukewatch.org. You'll see it in the top left-hand menu.
And Tom, go ahead if we don't have anyone else.
Okay, thanks. Jay, I'm wondering if the attorneys you have worked with have done a memorandum on the interaction between the statutory mandate and NEPA. If the statutory mandate is a hard mandate, I'm thinking a snail darter and the early NEPA litigation, and when the snail darter got in the way of Tellico Dam, Congress just passed legislation saying that NEPA didn't have to be complied with and the dam would be built. Is the statutory mandate in that nature, in which case I wonder why the SWEIS is happening? What is the interaction between the SWEIS and the statutory mandate, and do you have a memo on it?
Well, one thing I have, and send me an email, Tom, just to remind me, but I have excerpted the relevant statutes of the three different Defense Authorization Acts that pertain to PIP production. The stuff I said, LANL's required for 30 between Savannah and LANL, at least 80 pits per year. Oh, which brings up an interesting point, and Dylan alluded to it in his presentation, but there's actually a statutory requirement in one of those Defense Authorization Acts that Los Alamos have a plan for surge capacity in the event that pit production at the Savannah River site is delayed. And if I remember right, that was either the 2018 or 2019 Defense Authorization Act. So there's an item to file a Freedom of Information Act request. What's the plan? Because Savannah is not going to go, quote, hot with plutonium until like 2036. But anyway, to get back to my train of thought, send me an email, Tom, and I will send you what I excerpted from the Defense Authorization Acts pertaining to PIP production. Now, with respect to, did our lawyers write a memo? No, not per se. Our briefs, etc., are available on the NukeWatch website if you want to wade through them. I'm not completely sure what you're after, and that therefore I'm not sure I'm responding adequately to you. So.
Okay, then I assume that relationship between the statutory requirements and NEPA is briefed.
No, I'm not going to say it was anything that direct. But, because of your interests, you should go ahead and wade through the briefs. I've also, of particular interest, I thought, were the declarations I already mentioned by Stratcom Commander Anthony Cotton, who says the world's going to fall down, and then NSA Administrator Jill Ruby. That one's not that interesting. But I would particularly point to the declaration by NNSA Deputy Administrator Marvin Adams. And I quoted him a little bit. He claims PIP production is needed, first of all, because of aging, which Dylan, I think, has very well disputed. But he also says because of new military requirements. And then while you're at it, and this is just to give both Dylan and I a shout out, you should read our declarations as well. Dylan has a very good declaration that he filed on our behalf in that litigation. And they're all relatively new. They're like December.
Okay, well, thanks. Sophie, I have a couple more points, but again, we'll defer to others in the meantime.
Are there others? I'm still not exhausted, so lay it on us if you got questions.
This is Beata. I have a question again. So like with the solar array couched in the most extreme alternative, is there a way to, I don't know, I guess like what does that mean as far as like speaking on that piece? Like if you say you're in support of solar energy, but does that mean you're like speaking on that you're in support of alternative 3?
To clarify, so the solar arrays are part of alternative 3. And as far as I'm concerned, you and I, we can go right ahead and cherry pick. And you could say you're in favor of the solar arrays, but not in favor of that expanded operations alternative 3. And further, I'm going to argue that installation of those solar arrays should in fact be sped up, because when they talk in the site-wide, that's kind of like over a 15-year time horizon. And I myself, I'm going to argue speed it up so that the transmission line across the Caja del Rio doesn't have to be built. And that they're going to have, there's also other items. Joni Ahrens has pointed it out. And I don't fully understand it or barely understand it. But there's also going to be a solar generation company up near Farmington that is planning to ship or transmit solar generated electricity down to both Los Alamos County and Los Alamos Lab. The fundamental point I want to make is there is potentially a very abundant pool of electricity available to the laboratory, and they do not have to build that controversial transmission line across the Caja del Rio, which, by the way, and locals are going to know this who've keep up with the news, but there's been kind of a growing groundswell to have the Caja del Rio declared a national monument. Now, the prospects of that happening under Trump, of course, are quite dismal. But again, there is a lot of potential energy for Los Alamos. They don't need to build that transmission line across the Caja del Rio.
Jean, go ahead.
I'm just trying to get to my unmute.
Yes,
I
yes.
guess I am unmuted. Do you have a figure for like how much water this whole plutonium pit thing at LANL will take? I mean, I know water is such a big issue, but does anybody have like a figure?
I don't have it at my fingertips, but it will be in the site-wide. It won't be as narrow as for plutonium pit production, but it will be for the lab as a whole. And that's kind of one of the central things that a site-wide EIS does, is project future utility needs, electrical needs, and water usage. So again, I don't have it at my fingertips, but yes, it's in the site-wide for the site as a whole.
And Leah?
Yeah, I'm curious, like, so I gave testimony last week via Zoom to Livermore, and I'm rather new to this, though I've known, I've tried to pursue it for years. Like, why? It's just, is it it's the same NNSA that is doing both labs now?
Yes. And the entire weapons complex is NNSA, and that's 8 different sites across the country. Plus, I always feel compelled to mention Washington, D.C. as a site as well, where they're headquartered. Briefly, what you're talking about, and for the other folks, so I think it was around 15 years ago that the Lawrence Livermore Lab had what's called a Category 1/2 security category. And that meant that it could have large amounts of plutonium and specifically plutonium pits. But about 15 years ago, Livermore failed what they call a force on force exercise, a mock terrorist attack. And so NNSA revoked that security category 1/2 designation, downgraded it to security category 3, and a lot of plutonium had to leave the Livermore lab. But the present pits that Dylan has talked about for the new warhead that's called the W87-1, it is a Livermore design, and there's going to be traffic. It's a Livermore design, but LANL produces it. And there's going to be traffic between Los Alamos and Livermore where LANL sends a manufactured pit to Livermore so that Livermore can quality test it or do it, whatever. But I think a lot of it is just ownership, and the big bad boys at Livermore, they want their big stash of plutonium too. So I think a lot of this is prestige and so on and so forth. But in short, that's what that hearing was about, was Livermore Lab getting its security category 1-2 designation back so it can handle plutonium pits. And yes, it is very much related to plutonium pit production. It's commonly thought that there's only 2 sites involved in plutonium pit production, but in reality, there's Los Alamos and the Savannah River site, which are doing like the physical production of pits. But there is also the Livermore lab, as I said, W87-1 pit is a Livermore design. And then also the Kansas City plant is very involved in non-nuclear parts. And what is now known as the Nevada National Security Site, formerly the Nevada Test Site, is also involved because it does those subcritical experiments testing the new pits, or at least designs towards the new pits. So it's more than, I just want to impress upon you all, it's more than just Los Alamos and the Savannah River site.
And they transport plutonium from Livermore to Los Alamos and vice versa through Los Angeles at times, right?
I don't know the routes.
Okay.
I wouldn't think, they do it on the interstates and they do it in safe and secure transports. And I've done that road in the past, and you turn towards the Bay Area,
Bakersfield.
at Bakersfield and Barstow. Yeah.
And what about Pantex?
Well, Pantex, what ends, so again, Los Alamos and eventually Savannah River, according to their plan. So they produce the pits, and then, of course, they get sent to the Pantex plant just outside of Amarillo, Texas, for final assembly of nuclear weapons. Now, one thing, this reminds me, one thing that hasn't been said yet in this workshop, there are at least 15,000 existing pits already being stored at Pantex. And that's what I was referring to when I mentioned that Los Alamos would be processing up to 2.5 metric tons per year, basically taking the old pits that Pantex sends, and Los Alamos renders them. First of all, it cuts them in half, and then it renders them into plutonium oxide. Then that gets shipped to the Savannah River site, and then that gets shipped to WIP for ultimate disposal, which is nuts.
Jay, that was 15,000 pits at Pantex?
That's at least. And those are pits that are deemed to be, quote, excess. But there is another stash of pits that are called strategic reserve. And, that's classified. But that's probably 3,000 to 4,000 pits. And then Leah in the chat just asked, what is the acronym WIP? And thank you. I told all of us to avoid acronyms, but WIP is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant.
Project.
Excuse me, you're right. Waste Isolation Pilot Project.
Oh.
And it's currently the only deep geologic disposal dump for radioactive waste in the world. And note the coincidence that we have both pit production, plutonium pit production, and plutonium dumping all in the same poor state. So the Waste Isolation Pilot Project is down south near Carlsbad, New Mexico.
Near Carlsbad, famous for the beautiful caverns.
Mm-hmm.
Jay, I believe it's plant. At least the DOE website calls it Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, not project. Sorry to barge.
Yeah.
It's on their website right now.
I think it started as project and then went to plant, but it's a little immaterial.
The plant project.
But I think the important word is pilot. It wasn't supposed to end up being the only dump in the country. And it's important to note that NMED, New Mexico Environment Department, for the new WIP permit, requires DOE to start studying for another dump out of state. And there's a whole nother huge issue we did not touch. The National Academy of Science already projects that WIP is oversubscribed for all future plutonium wastes that DOE wants to send there. And NNSA just assumes that it can send plutonium pit production waste to WIP past the year 2050. And that more than half of WIP's future capacity will be taken up by plutonium pit production waste. So there's a fundamental point here. The mission of the Waste Isolation Pilot, now I need to look, is it plan or project, but WIP's mission is fundamentally changing from, quote, cleanup to direct support of expanded nuclear weapons production. We want the public to know that.
And Leah, I was just gonna say, I think I kind of recognize you from that hearing. Tri Valley Cares, I do some work with them also. Mary Leah Kelly may have some more. There may be some more info on the transportation routes through the Tri Valley Cares website. But I also wanted to note that I really, really appreciated your comments during that hearing. They were very impassioned and inspired me a lot. And just goes to show that even if you don't feel like you know all the issues totally and comprehensively, just getting your voice out there is really important to make your voice heard, but also you don't know who else is listening and may be inspired by it. So yes, good to see you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone
so
so much for an hour and a half over of your time. We have almost 30 people here still, so thank you all so much.
How about one last question from you, Tom? And then my stomach's starting to growl. It's time to go get dinner.
All right, thanks, Jay. You may have covered this to some extent in a question that Jessica Aberley asked about health impacts, and I had to take a break at that point. But my question is whether there is an assessment in the DEIS of the long-term health consequences of the increased radioactive emissions from LANL operations on the health of residents in surrounding communities.
So the direct answer is yes, there is. That's part A. And part B, all of these NNSA NEPA documents have ridiculously low dose calculations, both for occupational doses and public doses. And the reason I feel justified by that is those ridiculously low doses are in contrast to the calculated doses that the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board comes up with. That said, it's not always oranges to oranges and apples between NNSA calculations and safety board calculations. So that gets a little tough. But I can tell you that the safety board has postulated lethal doses at Los Alamos, and they are because of the so-called incompatible waste drums. And, you know, a lot of us will be aware of the fact that an errant drum prepared by Los Alamos was sent to WIP and ruptured underground, one could say blew up, on Valentine's Day, 2014. So it's these incompatible wastes, it's the mixture that could have a quote thermal event and actually have a lethal occupational dose. Now, the safety board used to say that there used to be more than 100 of those drums up at Los Alamos still. And I believe they're down now to 30 or so because they have been repackaging them. And then Scott and I were at the facility where they repackaged those drums. What was that, about a half year ago, Scott? And then, you know, I'm just going to tell you all that I kept a rat alert in my pocket while we were in that facility, and the rat alert froze. it like reached its max while we were in there. Huh?
What's a rattler?
Yeah. And rat alerts do counts per minute. I'm trying to remember what it froze at. I took a picture of it. I'd have to go back. I think it froze at 100 counts per minute while we were in that facility, and Los Alamos was showing it off and saying how safe it is. So.
Thanks, Jay.
Okay, should we order a pizza or what should we do? Gene has a question.
Well, yeah, just from stuff like that. Like if you did that on the rad count, do you still have that somewhere, the proof of that? I mean, is there any way that we can get some of these things out there? Like in 2006, after the Cerro Grande fire, we're in Penasco, we're 40 miles, downwind. And there was a study of our dust and our soil that showed, too much strontium-90 in my house, too much beryllium in the neighbors' plum trees. And the scientists told them, don't let your grandkids eat the plums. Is there any way we can use this kind of information? I mean, I don't have the actual study anymore, so I don't know, but where to even find it. But, to somehow push back on this nonsense?
Like I said, first of all, I took a picture with my iPhone of that rat alert, so I'd have to go back. But pointing to the future, Sophie gave a shout out to Dr. Michael Ketterer, and Sophie noted, we broke the story of his results back in August, and that story went around the world. That was really something. But what I'm reaching for now is that we plan to do more sampling with Dr. Michael Ketterer. And Gene, if you could make a case that Dr. Ketterer should come to where you are, we can sample for it. Now, as an example, he sampled for fallout from the Trinity test in Truchas, so kind of near your area, and he found some. And not that much, but nevertheless, he found some. But well, I don't need to whine to you. NukeWatch has limited time and money, but we'll be able to do some more sampling with Dr. Michael Ketterer. So.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that a really important thing to do, and I want you to know that Dr. Ketterer caused DOE big time fits at the Portsmouth plant in Ohio. And as a result, he found serious contamination in a public elementary school about 2 miles from the plant. And, the local board of education shut that elementary school down, and DOE had a lot of splaining to do. So Michael already has a track record with DOE. And as far as I'm concerned, he has the proper attitude towards DOE, which is pretty aggressive.
Well, let me know when he's here, and if I can contribute something to get him to, come up here, or somehow we can make it happen. Because since there was a study in 2006, it might be valuable to do one in the same place, this much going forward.
Yes. Dylan put something in the chat, and he referred to another analyst, Marco Catalfin, who we also know. And I think it was a good 10 years ago, Scott went up with Marco Catalfin to take some samples around Los Alamos. And ironically, the highest reading they got, they pulled lint from the bathroom fan in the office of the state's Environment Department's DOE Bureau. That's where they got their highest reading. I just think that's funny.
Who had the water question a while back, just a little bit ago, about the water usage? I found that chart. Um,
Was that Beata?
oh, was it Beata?
Dylan said it was Jean. Jean, you're muted. Go ahead.
No, I think that water question was me, but let's go ahead.
Well, it's a 70% increase of the expanded operations over the no action alternative, from 290 million gallons per year that's for the no action alternative, 290, and the expanded operations demand is estimated at 495, which is a 70% increase.
Yeah, wow. That's
Wow.
big. That's big.
I
I
put
would point out,
the table number in the chat if anybody
yeah,
wants.
thank you, Scott. I would point out that a lot of it, I'm speculating, but a lot of it's probably because of supercomputers and artificial intelligence.
They just say operations, so they
Yeah.
don't break it out, of course.
Yep.
Hi.
Go ahead.
This is Elizabeth West, and I just have a picture here of a hunk of salt that I got down at Whip. I don't know if you can see it. And
Yeah.
it's yummy. It's just salt, pink, beautiful salt. And we went down, a bunch of us from the library in Santa Fe went down, way down deep inside. And when we came up, we were given something kind of like Kool-Aid. I mean, they were all drinking it, so why shouldn't we? No, sorry, that's a joke. Anyway, we were drinking out of styrofoam cups, and they were telling us about how great this thing, whip, was going to be, just for a little bit of waste, nothing much. It was going to really help the environment. And I thought, how ironic. I said, well, I'm somehow I don't believe this. It's very nice of you to give us this drink, but it's being served in styrofoam, and I'm getting the feeling that we're not getting the whole truth. Anyway, I offer this to people, and I lick it, and people say, "Oh, that's going to be dangerous." I said, "No, I got it before." That's what I want to share with you.
Thanks.
Well, I don't know. Licking salt makes me want dinner. I think I'll put salt on my dinner. What do you say we finally call it quits?
Well, Jay, if I could, just one quick comment,
Yeah.
because I'd like to ask for more information. And that is, when you talk about advising that the children can't eat the plums off the plum tree, I think we're talking about psychosocial impact. And
Yes.
I'd like to get a lot more examples of that sort of psychosocial impact, because I want to promote the idea that we need an in-depth psychosocial impact for the surrounding communities.
Well, Tom, one thing you can try to research, there used to be a hotel up there called the Los Alamos Inn. They have since demoed it. It's not there anymore. But back in the day, and it would have been in the back of the Los Alamos Inn, but they had peach trees, and they cut them down because of the tritium in the peach trees. So that's one thing you can look at. It was also it was on a flat spot in the back of that hotel, and then went down into a slope that was called Hillside 138, which was an old dump, and it was notorious for mercury and the like. And so you can look into that and look into those peach trees. But I don't have citations at my fingertips for that. But going back to Dr. Michael Ketterer, one thing that has really been grossly overlooked, and I need to make a note to myself to make sure this ends up in our comments. And it's only because of Michael that NukeWatch is aware of this issue. But a real concern is uptake of plutonium by plants.
Yes.
And you take it one step further. In New Mexico, every plant, that's permanent, whether it's successive generations or let's just say the forests, they're all going to burn one time or another. And if you've been in Acid Canyon, you know that, it's a nice ponderosa forest that you're walking through there. And when we were last there, there was actually flowing water. It's ephemeral, but when we were there, there was flowing water. We took samples under Michael's direction. He came up, the highest sample was 83 picocuries, plutonium-239 per liter of water. And Michael said that's the highest reading he's ever had in an unrestricted area. And it's not only unrestricted, it is a popular hiking area. But back to the point I was starting to make, Michael emphasized plant uptake of plutonium, which bioaccumulates, and it's going to burn one time or another. And by definition, that's respirable plutonium. Now, looking back retroactively, what does that mean for the 2000 Cerro Grande fire, which, by the way, the entire AirNet system, monitoring for ambient radioactive contamination, the entire AirNet system went down. When it was most needed, it was not operative. Basically because the filters clogged and the whole area was evacuated. There was nobody to service the filters.
Or they do it on purpose.
Well, I didn't want to say it, you did. But I will repeat, when it was most needed, AirNet went down.
Yeah, and when those people came and tested my dirt, it was because it was after the Cerro Grande, and they were looking for somebody that had. It was 6 years afterwards, and they wanted to know who still had dust from before Cerro Grande. I said I probably have dust from before 1945, so in different parts of my house, so. And their point was like those AirNet monitors where it's just the air going through it. It's just like now. Whereas the accumulated dust, which is on the floor right where your kids play, and if you're not a real good house cleaner, which some of us aren't,
yes,
it's right down there and it accumulates.
Right. And again, the Cerro Grande fire burned 3,500 acres on the lab.
Right.
I don't worry about the 2000 Las Conchas fire because that was to the west and it did hit the western boundary of the lab, but it didn't intrude on lab property itself. But the Cerro Grande fire, there's outstanding questions there that probably will never be answered.
Right. And they let me know about the results on the 4th of July while I was working in my garden, which wasn't good, and I said, well, what am I supposed to do about it? And they said, well, you should get all these fancy HEPA vacuum cleaners or whatever. And I said, I can't afford to do it. I was afraid to sweep my floor for 6 months, but I finally got over it and, whatever.
Psychosocial impact.
I know. So I gave you my email so that in case I've got more of that stuff.
Okay, this is it.
All right, goodbye.
Unless somebody's going to send me a pizza for immediate delivery, this is it.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jay.
I want to thank Dylan. Thank you very much, Dylan, for your presentation. I remind you all, he's going to come out with a major important report on pip production in a couple of months. So
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Great job.
Take good care.
Thank you. Dylan, we'll look forward to your book in the New York Times.
I'll leave the chat. I'll leave the meeting open for a bit. If you want to save the chat, go ahead.
And thank you, Sophie, for doing all the legwork, the hosting and everything else.
Went pretty smooth.
Hey, good night, everybody.
Night.
Night.
Bye, Sophie. Thanks.
Yes, good night. Bye.